I think every person has a COVID story. I think COVID changed people's lives forever. But for me, in 2019, I took on a rotational role in Kazakhstan, and it was in the oil and gas industry as well. And initially, it was supposed to be a 28-day rotation. And so,
as medical director,
as a medical doctor,
as a medical,
/ medical advisor for this company, it's the largest producer of oil in Kazakhstan, and the 28-day on-off rotation and just the new environment and was super exciting. And I had worked in oil and gas, so I kind of knew the system. I knew what was required, etc. So, but I was intrigued by the 28 days because I thought, shit, this is great. You work for 28 days, and then after that you board a plane and you come home and then you're off for 28 days, right? I mean, it means you're only working like 6 months of the year. Like, who wouldn't want that? But then I got to my second hitch, which is what we call the time that you're on site working. And I remember my second hitch leaving here, and then the news, there was a little bit of news coming out about what was happening in China. There's this something's happening. Something's happening. We're not really sure, but there's this strange illness that's going around, and doctors are trying to figure out what this is. And my first rotation was an extended rotation because my back-to-back wasn't able to start yet. So on my second rotation, he was coming in. So there was going to be this overlap. And I reached Kazakhstan, and I remember picking him up one night, and I said to him, this was the second day, I think, after he had landed. And I said to him,
Sorry, who is this?
This is my back-to-back, the other doctor. So who would work on the 28 days that I would be off. And, we're in this taxi, and I said to him, have you read about this strange
Did you hear about
thing that's happening? Yeah. And he said, yeah, I have, but, whatever. And I remember sitting in the car, just the discussion, I had this uneasy feeling inside, but it was okay, maybe it's whatever. So now we're into the beginning of 2020, right? Because I started sort of the end of 2019. And it was on that second hitch that I got the call from home, from Singapore. It was a Friday afternoon. And at the time, over that period, over that hitch, things were starting to ramp up a little bit, right? And so the organization had started listening to, what was happening. They were like, look, I think we need to start preparing for if this is something bigger. And then, WHO was coming out with all of the information at the time.
Yeah, it was slow and then really fast.
Correct.
Yep.
Right? So in that time, we went from starting with oh, there's a strange thing to towards the end being all right, I think we need to stand up an emergency management team so that, if all of this goes to shit, we have some preparation going. And then I got the call on that Friday night to say, well, Singapore has made the decision that on the Sunday at midnight, they're closing the borders. And I remember thinking, okay, well, now I'm a little conflicted here because I've been called up to be the medical representative on this emergency management team. And at the same time, I'm supposed to go home at some point. My hitch isn't over yet, but the borders are going to close. And if I don't get back by that Sunday, what does that mean? It means
you don't see your son.
Yeah. Don't see my son, don't see my husband. It's, where do I go then? Right? Where do I go? And I was looking at possible flights. And there wasn't.
From Kazakhstan
into Singapore. And there wasn't any flights available that could get me in by the cutoff time anyways. And I was like, is that a sign? I'm supposed to be here? But ultimately, the bigger pull was the fact that I'm a medical professional. I took this Hippocratic oath. I am here to help people. And if I've been called up to take on this role as the medical lead in the response to this, then there's a duty that I need to uphold, right? At the time, I had no idea how things were going to obviously play out and the shit that was going to come after that. But that was sort of like my position. And so I couldn't get back in, borders closed in Singapore. Fast forward, to summarize, what ended up happening was I got stuck in Kazakhstan for, I think it was 8 months in 2020. And during that time, I had tried to get back, but you couldn't, because if you weren't a PR or if you weren't a citizen, you had to, PRs and citizens were given first preference to enter the country. So you had to go through this application process, and then you were quarantined. I spent a lot of time in quarantine. And it took 8 months. And I wrote letters to like people in the ministry saying, please, you know, I'm on the front line. My family's here. I just want to be able to come home so I didn't leave on holiday. Like I left to go and work. And it was just, well, you know, this is the system. And I understand that, but it was hard. And of course, in that time, you know, things, as you mentioned, you know, it was like slow, slow, slow. And then
And so it was
crazy.
It got really intense there.
It got super intense. Absolutely. So we ended up having to evacuate. So just to give you context, like there's about 90,000 people that work in this like oil and gas area.
How many?
Right? 90,000 in total. And they're all mostly shift workers. So you're looking at anything from about 45,000 plus that's on shift at any given moment of time. So when COVID hit, it meant that we needed to evacuate these people home. And these were employees and contractors that lived around the world.
All over, yeah.
And as time was passing, countries were closing off their borders. And what that meant for us was that, one, it was a massive logistic mission to get people back home through their embassies, special chartered flights, you know, the testing protocols for each country, the quarantine protocols for each country. But we needed to drop the footprint because we wouldn't be, if there was an outbreak, we wouldn't be able to manage it, right? So the decision was made. And I mean, yeah, we were successful in getting people home, but it was a process for sure. But then, you know, we as everything stopped globally, that also meant that our evacuation options were cut off. So where we had the ability to, if somebody was sick, let's say a foreign employee, we could evacuate them out to our nearest center of excellence, either with our own plane or with an air ambulance. But now that countries were closed, you know, those started closing, those options started closing off. And it got to a point where the countries were only accepting their own citizens into that country. And if you had COVID, you was like, you know, there were very limited places that you could go to because nobody wanted to accept a COVID patient, right? So it just felt like everything was closing in. And then, you know, locally, outside of like once we had evacuated or sort of reduced our employee footprint, it then became a mission of like, okay, well, we need quarantine facilities. We need to expand our hospital capabilities, right? We need to expand ICU. We need oxygen. We need medical staff. So it was this ramp up of trying to pull in, as you know, nurses and doctors were in high demand at the time, and everybody was looking for them everywhere. I mean, we mobilized every single medical staff member that we could. They were flying in from, and we had to get special clearances to get them in. It was intense.
So you could protect the people in
that was left behind.
Yeah.
And a lot of them too, you know, there were expatriates, but there was also a very large like national population too, right? That we needed to protect and to provide resources for and ensure that there were options available. But, you know, things like ventilators, oxygen became scarce resources, right? And the local hospitals were overwhelmed. And I remember getting, a call one night from a local employee, like begging me to, to help his father who wasn't able to breathe, and they couldn't accept him in the hospital. There was no oxygen. And my hands were tied in what I could do, right? And it just, like, the intensity of that moment of, I'm trained to help. We're talking about oxygen, right? Like the life force that we all need. And yet it's something that we're unable to provide, right? I mean, I was trained in a resource limited setting, right? South Africa, that's how they train us on how to do things when your resources are limited. But my experience in Kazakhstan was something that I will never ever forget. I'm grateful for it, but it was a crazy time. I think the one thing that I regret, and I've spoken to some of my colleagues from the time, one thing that I regret not doing is journaling every day of what happened. Because when I talk about it, it almost feels, when I go into like the details of what was going, like we had no paracetamol, we had no, like, there was no ibuprofen. So like, how do you manage a fever? Like simple things like that became very challenging to manage, like, in the local context of stuff. It was a very interesting time for sure. And it got to a point where the evacuation routes were closed. I couldn't go home to Singapore. We had no air ambulance to take me home to my home country, which was South Africa, if I got sick. And I was working on the front line. And, the ICUs at the time were full. We had, I think, 2 or 3 ventilators, like private, in our one facility that we had. We had an anesthetist on board. And I remember, getting home one evening, and it was long days, and sitting, like, standing on the balcony, and there's nobody in the streets. And, I called him and I said to him, there's a chance that we could get sick. We don't know how this is going to play out for any one of us. Are we healthy? Yeah, sure. But we have no guarantees right now. I said, but I have a son back home, and my family is back home. And, the ventilators are in short supply here. So I need you to try and keep me alive. If something happens to me, I need your word that you will try and keep me alive for as long as you can, so that I can see them, or that they can see me. And it was a moment that fundamentally, I think, also played into changing, like, my perspective on life as well.
Because you've never had to face your mortality like that.
Yeah, it was never like in my face. And I'd never felt so scared. But you can't let that, if you're leading a team and, you've got to lead by example, and you've got all these nurses working for you, and you're, or in your team, and you're out there swabbing, you can't have that fear. Because if I carry that, then you're going to pick up on that energy. You're going to pick up on my fear. So yeah, I over the years, I've learned to box it. It just goes back to your first about pretending, right? And yeah, there is a certain element of that for sure. I think it's a little bit of, you're putting on this brave face. You've also built some capacity to be able to deal with it, but you're mindful of the moment and what your presence means potentially for other people, right? If you're losing your shit, then everybody else around you is going to lose theirs too, right?
Yeah, you're playing with fire by containing those emotions, but if you don't, there's some pretty dire consequences.
Yeah.
You don't really have a choice.
But it has to be released at some point, right? So went through that, was able to get home for a little bit.
And then everything was fine.
And then everything was fine at home for a little bit. And then I went back on my next hitch out, and then we all thought COVID was fine, and the borders started opening, and then we were hit with a Delta wave, and then it was like round 2.
So you had a good month back home.
It was probably about almost like 6 weeks, I think.
And then
And then I was
called to go back.
Well, we were expected to go back. You know, we weren't all in the clear yet, but things were looking up. And obviously my contract carried on. So I needed to go back. And I remember when things shut down, I was like, you have got to fucking be kidding me. Like, here I am again. And there was a risk, I will say. At the time, people were like, oh, we're not sure. Like this, are they not? Maybe. But again, there's this calling, right? Like, this is what I need to do from a professional standpoint. And maybe I didn't want to believe that it could possibly happen again, right? And then it did. We were hit with the Delta wave. And then I got stuck out for I came back in, I think it was October, I think. So yeah, it was close to 8-9 months again, you know, dealing with very similar things. Although now we then had to like pivot because we went through the Delta wave and then things kind of quickly progressed to like, all right, well, now there's all these vaccines, right? So now we need to start vaccinating the working population and we need to start slowly remobilizing them back in for work. So that became another big logistic move to try and move the workforce back in and get everybody vaccinated. So it was setting up vaccination centers, working with local providers, where we're going to get the vaccines. I've been vaccinated with every vaccine that exists for COVID. But yeah,